The Bishop's Corner is a production of CTNY, the Catholic television network of the Diocese of Youngstown. It is a show highlighting the new evangelization called for by Pope Benedict XVI, who calls the Church to proclaim in word and deed the gospel of God to all people. Your host is Bishop George Murray, and your moderator is Father Jim Corda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Bishop's Corner. I'm your moderator, Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Bishop George Murray. Welcome to our series on the new evangelization.
And now we are welcoming Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, and we're talking about the ecumenical approach to evangelization. Welcome, Bishop Eaton.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I think for our show now, we'd like to first define ecumenism and then define evangelization. Bishop Eaton, if you would define the first, and Bishop, evangelization.
Well, ecumenism comes from a word in Greek which means household. And so the sense is that we are one household of faith. Maybe we don't look that way very much, but how then do we once again recover this unity that is already ours in Christ and will be realized finally when history is fulfilled? How do we realize that and then work together to help other people be invited into the good news of the gospel?
Evangelization.
And evangelization, if I may take a cue from Bishop Eaton, is bringing our brothers and sisters into the house of faith. Jesus, at the time of his return to his Father after his resurrection, told us to go out and make disciples, to welcome them into the community of the faith. An evangelist is one who carries the message and who welcomes in.
How important is it for us to have an ecumenical approach to evangelization in this day and age? Bishop Eaton.
I think it's critical now. The way the religious voice in the United States in popular culture and media is pretty distorted. I think we've been eroding, and mostly when people think about Christianity, they think about evangelical Christians. Then they might think about Roman Catholics, and maybe somewhere down the list, Lutherans. But there's not an understanding of the church and of the faith being something that brings true meaning to people's lives, brings true freedom to people, brings the true possibility for service and obedience and love, because it's so fragmented. And so it's critical for us to work together to help to reclaim the authentic Christian voice instead of the one I think that's been distorted by the popular culture, and to invite people who really don't even know they need to know Jesus into fellowship.
Isn't it interesting that when we talk about Christianity, we talk about love and respect and brotherhood and sisterhood and community, but yet sometimes there's those differences that become a roadblock to that evangelization effort. And how contrary is it for us to be Christian and yet to have those feelings, I guess?
Well, there are some roadblocks, and many of them are historical roadblocks. And we are in dialogue on a number of fronts about those various historic roadblocks. But on one thing we can certainly all agree, and Bishop Eaton just touched on that, it's the centrality of Jesus Christ and his message. And if we can work together on spreading that message and helping people to realize that that is where they can find true peace in their lives and hope for the future, I think then we're making progress. If we get stuck on the roadblocks, as important as they are, they're going to simply hold us back. Those dialogues have to go on, such as the Lutheran Catholic dialogue. But we also have to focus on the important prize of communion with Jesus Christ.
We're going to talk in the second part of our show specifically on the Lutheran Catholic dialogue here in the diocese and in the Northeastern Synod. But we want to primarily talk now about the ecumenical approach. And the phrase that comes to my mind is when Jesus said to Peter, now you will be catching people instead of fish. You know, there's that whole sense that the arms of the church are going out to gather people within its fold. And how significant is that whole concept of catching fish, catching people, Bishop Eaton?
I think it's critical, and it's also made more difficult by the fact that Christianity is a countercultural movement. Both of our traditions talk about the importance of community as opposed to the autonomy of the individual. We both of us talk about finding true freedom in obedience, that we find true life in service, and that we need to die to ourselves every day in order to receive new life. That is just not part of the American message right now. So if we can do that ecumenically, I think maybe we can make some more of an impact than we do if we do that separately.
And I believe that one of the approaches of contemporary culture that is problematic is a divide and conquer approach. And we are strongest when we are standing together, helping people to encounter the Lord and His goodness, His love, and His forgiveness.
Someone made a statement I read recently that we should forget all of our differences, whatever our religion is, and bring people together. Is that something that we should do, or should we remember that there are some things that are different from us?
I think it's important in the very creation story. I call it the gift of limits. And God put limits around human beings because it helps to define them. So we have these defining things about us that makes it more possible for us to engage with others. So if we just say, forget everything and all of our differences, then somehow we're watering down something that's essential and makes it even more possible for us, because we understand our limits and our definitions, to engage with somebody else. And there's more integrity to that.
I totally agree. And I think it's understanding not necessarily our differences, but the roots and the foundations and the traditions that we have, and using those as a basis to build on and to build up God's kingdom. When we talk about evangelization, is it appropriate to say that there's a different approach, Catholic, Protestant, to evangelization, or is it the same?
I wouldn't say that there's a different approach. I would think that there are particulars along the way that would be different, but in my conversations with Bishop Eaton and with other leaders of Protestant faiths, I think we're going after the same goal. So I wouldn't see very much difference there.
We're coming down to the last few minutes of our first segment. Later on in the show, we're going to talk about interfaith relations, and perhaps when we get into this next segment and talk about the actual dialogue between Lutherans and Catholics here in the diocese, we can also touch on that as well, and to get a perspective as to how the other faiths, non-Christian faiths, are part of this whole process with us as well. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to our show. Bishop Murray and I are talking with Bishop Eaton, and we're now going to focus on Lutheran Catholic dialogue. Bishops, I know that your predecessors began a covenant some years ago, and let's historically share the beginnings of that.
Bishop Eaton, would you like to begin?
I'll try. I was merely a parish pastor at the time, but I think it was Bishop Miller and Bishop Tobin for your diocese. And we decided that it's probably better to work more together than apart. And it was also around the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification that this became very, not only prominent and critical, but immediate. So here, a difference that has separated our two churches for 5 centuries, we had this amazing consensus that came about. So we thought, let's live that out. Let's not just have it be a piece of paper in Augsburg, but let's really live that out.
And the document that was put together, the Lutheran Catholic Covenant Agreement, focused on 3 important areas, and they were study, prayer, and action. And we meet at least once a year to talk about how we are following out the covenant. And we had a big celebration at the cathedral last year. to lift that up and to help the people of both of our dioceses to understand the importance of this covenant and to support the covenant.
Let's talk about those three different areas, if we could. Let's begin with prayer, and how is that dialogue focused on prayer?
Well, when we gather, we pray together. And that's exactly what is most important there, an opportunity for us to come together, to be with each other, and to pray to the God whom we both adore as Lutherans and as Catholics. And when we had the ceremony at the cathedral, and Bishop Eaton and I have been at other ceremonies together where we have jointly led those ceremonies and led our people in prayer, both Lutherans and Catholics.
Bishop Eaton, how important is prayer when we talk about evangelization? How crucial is it?
If we are not somehow in constant communication or open to constant communication from God, how on earth can we do anything that's meaningful, has integrity, and has the staying power? That's lifeblood.
Let's talk about the study part of it as well, part of the dialogue. How is it important for Catholics to understand Lutherans and vice versa in that whole study process?
Well, I think that the more we know about the historical development of our two faiths, the more we can understand, as we were saying in the earlier segment, where the similarities are and also where the differences are. And I liked what Bishop Eaton said about the limitations that God puts on us. I think that if we try to eliminate the differences, the body of Lutherans, the body of Catholics, just somehow reduces into jello. You can't get your hands around it. We do have differences, and those differences have come out of a long history and tradition. We can learn a lot from each other in those differences. Are there things that we differ on that we can work through and come to a common understanding? Yes. And that was recently done in Lutheran Catholic dialogue on the Eucharist. It was also done on justification. Now, we still have a ways to go, but we can talk those theological issues through, but there are always going to be differences. And I think just as a husband and wife have differences and come to love each other for the differences, we can do the same.
The study part's important too because our people found out a lot about their own tradition by the study part. It's stunning. We were having a table conversation with Lutherans and Catholics we were having the discussion about the Eucharist, and the Catholics were saying, "Oh, you believe in the real presence?" That we said yes, and there's some Lutherans who don't realize that we believe in the real presence. So it's instructive for us to take a look at who we are. And you cannot really engage in a dialogue with somebody else unless you know who you are.
And how important is action, is actually putting your money where your mouth is through all of this?
Always an important thing. And especially I think for us as Christians, that song that was so often sung in the early years of the Christian faith, see how they love one another. We have to put into action what we believe, or else we become empty and our faith has no meaning.
Not only that, but we become unbelievable.
Yes, good point.
Absolutely. When they make housing developments now, they only allot a certain amount of property to churches because they see there's no value added from a Christian community to a new housing development. So if we just talk or just sort of gather amongst ourselves like the apostles did in the locked room, we turn into museums and we have no credibility.
Let's talk about the mission of the church, which is the unity of the church. The phrase comes to mind, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. How do we celebrate that ecumenically in the whole new evangelization?
Well, I think we have to realize that there is one Lord, there is one faith, there is one baptism. How that experience is expressed will be different. But we have to keep our eye on the prize, and that prize is that we are unified. And that point that Bishop Eaton made about value added, again, we can't add value to our society. We can't draw value from our society unless we are authentic in our faith, unless we live what we say we are and who we say we are. So that's a beautiful phrase in the scriptures about one Lord, one faith, one baptism. We have to keep growing toward that so that, as Jesus said, all may be one.
And we know that obviously the hope for us, at least here locally, is to continue that process, to continue that dialogue and communication. What would be, in closing, the hopes that each of you have in light of Lutheran Catholic dialogue? Bishop Eaton?
Well, my fondest hope, and I wish it would happen in my lifetime, but the Church's pace of progress is usually glacial, is that we could join together at the table. I think every time when our communities join together, there's always a seat empty because you're not there, and vice versa. And that would be marvelous if we could at some point be able to do that. And that would be a witness.
Historically, of all of the Protestant churches, we are closest to the Lutheran Church in terms of our beliefs on the Eucharist. And I think that it would be wonderful if we could at one point come together and celebrate that unity at the table of the Lord.
Then I can work myself out of a job, and you can be the bishop of the whole area. It'd be great.
Or you could.
Bishop Eaton, thank you very much for being with us. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to our show. Our guest now is Father Joe Whitmer, and we're going to specifically talk about the interfaith approach to evangelization. Father Whitmer, when we talk about evangelization, obviously we talk about Christianity and promoting the gospel. Is it appropriate for us to talk about interfaith in light of evangelization?
I think it is, especially for our Catholic part, because we have different motivations to engage in interfaith relations and to do evangelism. Vatican II, 50 years ago, started this concern. Pope John the 23rd wanted something specific about Catholics and Jews, and then that was expanded to other religions. And that quest for dialogue between Catholics and other Christians and other religions was put there, not in a way to become another subtle way of trying to convert everybody else, but a way of trying to meet our neighbor who belong to these world religions in the different parts of the world with so many different configurations. So how to respect authentic interreligious dialogue and yet carry out the Christian understanding of mission or evangelization is always a challenge.
If we could, Bishop, let's talk briefly about Nostra Aetate. That we know was one of the decrees out of the Second Vatican Council. It was actually the shortest decree, and I think initially it was titled Decree on the Jews, but that obviously got expanded when the document was finished. Let's talk a little bit about Nostra Aetate and its aims and goals, and we'll use that as a springboard to talk more about the interfaith approach.
Well, Nostra Aetate, as you say, began with a hope of Pope John the 23rd that they would address something about the Jewish family. And that was something that some bishops didn't want to do too much because of their home church was in a predominantly Muslim country who were at war. And they felt it might hurt the existence of the church, the ministry of the church, even among themselves back home. And other world religions, they had their apprehension too, because how do you encourage ecumenical dialogue and still be missionaries? So that was their concern, their real challenge. But that did in fact get extended, and actually the focus was on world religions in general, and then Islam in particular, and then added a fourth section, which was on Judaism, although eventually relations with the Jews were put under the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, now Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. But dealing with the other world religions is now in the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue.
I think that a key there, of course, in that document was the realization that a variety of religions and a variety of historic traditions are unified in seeing a value in helping people come to encounter the Lord. And they may encounter the Lord in a variety of ways, but I think that that document wanted us to realize that that needs to be an action on the part of all believers, and that's really the key to evangelization. It's that reaching out, not only among Jews and Muslims and Catholics and Protestants, but that all of us together want people to know the experience that we've had with God and welcome them into the family of God.
Let's talk briefly about our relationship with the Jewish community and how we are rooted in tradition. And Father Whitmer, if you could talk briefly about that.
Certainly, our self-understanding is that Jesus was a Jew, Mary was a Jew, the apostles were Jews, so our, as it were, initial experience was among Judaism. And so we need to, again, as the subject that we're talking about in general, how do you affirm our Jewish roots without at the same time seeking to convert every Jew to be a Christian or a Catholic? So that's always a problem, was in the first century, still is. So we're in many communities, including our own, good personal relations, and sometimes in things that are done cooperatively enhance the relationship that we have.
We're coming down to the last couple minutes of our show. Let's continue our discussion on relationship with other faiths. Not necessarily a Christian faith, but Muslims, the Jewish community. How important, Bishop, is it for us as a church, but also as a local community, to have relations and solid relations with other faith communities?
I think that's extremely important because there is so much we can learn from those other communities, from their history, from their tradition, from their culture, from their literature. We can exchange a great deal that can help us to understand how God is present in our world, how God has touched their tradition, and then their openness to understanding and learning about our tradition. One of the things that was most important in Vatican II was the emphasis on dialogue. And I think the more we are in dialogue with people of other faiths, the better it is for us as believers around the world.
I think not only dialogue, but I think that word that pops into my mind is the word respect. Mm-hmm. Respecting one another's faith traditions, one another's area of how we worship God, how we approach that whole sense of holiness. And so understanding that sense of respect certainly draws us together. And I think that's the ultimate goal of evangelization, is to bring us in the world together. We're coming down now to the last few minutes. I'd like you, Father Whitmer, to give us some kind of thoughts on where you see us headed as a church with interfaith dialogue and with interfaith relations in light of evangelization.
The Vatican sees itself as having its particular dimension where it can cooperate with the World Council of Churches Office of Interreligious Relations. And also it has ways of making contacts, accepting invitations in different parts of the world, and also welcoming other religious leaders as they come to Rome. The Dalai Lama, for instance, and others who have come to visit the Pope. But they said probably the most important part of this work is done in regions and areas around the world where these religions are there in numbers, and the local contact can be established and maintained. Probably Greater Youngstown doesn't have a great number of many of these world religions, so we are challenged that way. But we do what we can.
Well, Father Whitmer, thank you very much for being with us. And thank you. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Bishop's Corner is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your host has been Bishop George Murray, and your moderator was Father Jim Corda.